Hello and welcome to the World Wanders podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts.
Hello and welcome back to the World Wanders podcast. We hope that wherever in the world you are right now, that you're doing well and staying safe. And we're excited to share a new interview with you guys this week with David Gold from the Casco Antiguo Spanish School, which is a Spanish school based in the old town of Panama City, where we've actually been taking lessons while living in Panama and continuing now that we are back in Canada. And one of the things that we've learned as we've taken this adventure as nomads is that having ways to build community when you're going to new places is really important. And for us in the past, that's been things like going to co-working spaces, occasionally meetups. And this time in Panama, we weren't going to be using a co-working space. And so we wanted to make sure that we were doing something in person that gave us an opportunity to meet people. And that's what going to Spanish classes was for us. At the Casco Antiguo Spanish School, they do a lot of really cool community events and gives you a cool opportunity to meet lots of people and connect beyond people you already know. And part of that was learning about David and learning about his story and how he came to start and now runs the Spanish school. And as we just were chatting kind of here and there before and after Spanish classes, both Amanda and I started to realize that David would make a great podcast guest. He has a really fascinating story that you'll learn as we talk to him about kind of leaving the States to go to school and go to university in Canada. And then after that, traveling abroad, learning Spanish, and really blending a love of travel and adventure with a love of languages and an entrepreneurial streak. And so those are three things that we all that Amanda and I and a lot of you listening all share. And so we really enjoyed talking to David about his history with that, about his history starting businesses, what it's like to start a business in Panama and to run a Spanish school. I think that's something that it's really fascinating to hear about entrepreneurs who aren't from countries and what it's like to start a business there. So I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. And if you're looking to learn a language during this time, definitely check out Casco Antiguo Spanish School. You can go to cascospanish.com to find out more information. And also just want to put a reminder out there that we have the World Wanders Insider podcast, which you can get access to through Patreon, patreon.com/theworldwanders, where we're focusing on talking to people who are location independent, who are working and traveling. Well, in this moment, not traveling, but working in different places and doing it online. So if that's something you're looking to do to expand your income and opportunities in terms of remote work, definitely go to patreon.com/theworldwanders, where you can get access to the World Wanders Insider and listen to those podcast episodes that are specifically focused on online work. Without further ado, here is David and the interview. All right, welcome back to the podcast. We are very excited today to be joined by David Gold from the Casco Antiguo Spanish School here in Panama City. David, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, and so a little bit of behind the scenes. Amanda and I have been going to Spanish lessons here at Casco Antiguo for, I guess, 2 months at this point. And we've really enjoyed kind of hearing a little bit more about your story the few times that we've been able to chat. We're really excited to kind of get you sat down and find out all about your adventure in Panama. And so to start off with, David, what brought you to Panama in the first place?
So I originally grew up in Connecticut, right outside New York City. And I went to university, actually in Canada, in Montreal, at McGill. And I studied international development. So after studying international development, I decided to work in it and see if it was for me. So I was sent to Bolivia for the Peace Corps. So that's actually where I learned Spanish initially when I arrived in the Peace Corps. And one of the main reasons I started the school was my experience learning Spanish in Bolivia in the Peace Corps. So I came to Panama 10 years ago, basically with a backpack on vacation and stayed. And it's been, over 10 years now I've been here.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what was your first experience when you arrived to Panama like? Like, were you instantly like, I'm going to call this place home, or did it grow on you over time, or what was that experience?
It definitely grew on me over time because I had been traveling South America. My plan after the Peace Corps was to go from Bolivia to New York by land. And I made it all the way up to Colombia and then realized you can't actually go north from Colombia to Panama without getting on a boat or getting on a plane. So I ended up coming to Panama by boat And I had friends of friends who were living here who introduced me to other people. And I ended up basically staying.
Okay, and I want to follow up and talk a little bit more about that process of getting the idea of starting a business. But before we do that, I want to kind of rewind a little bit to Bolivia. What was it like? So this would have been like 12 years ago in Bolivia. What was it like? Where were you in Bolivia, and what was that experience like?
It was a total culture shock. I was living down 7 hours on a dirt road from the closest city in a town of about 500 people in the mountains. So I was the only English speaker in the town, and I was 21 years old when I got there. So everyone who was my age in that town was already married with kids, or from the city working at the school. But there really weren't a lot of people my age. So it was definitely a big culture shock. And after the Peace Corps, after living in that small town, I had a year in Santa Cruz, which was like a transition. I was working fourth grade teacher at a private school, the Santa Cruz International School.
Wow. Yeah. I can only imagine what Bolivia was like in a rural town like 12 years ago. We went there, I guess, 6 years ago and didn't do a ton of rural stuff, just a kind of gringo trail. I'm sure you know all about that in Bolivia. And yeah, definitely a different culture down there and just a different world.
Yeah, I was really happy because with Peace Corps is a U.S. Volunteer program where now I think you apply to a specific country and say, I want to be in this program in this country, and they either accept you or not based on your experience. But at the time you applied and they said Bolivia, and you said yes or no. And if you said no, you could wait 6 months and they would send you a new offer. So it was really a grab bag. I could have gone anywhere. So I was excited to get a place that I felt I probably wouldn't have the opportunity to really experience in depth in another way. I didn't want somewhere where people are like, oh, we have a timeshare there, a vacation destination, even though I'm sure even a place like Costa Rica, there are, rural towns, and they wouldn't have put me in, Cancun or something like that. But
yeah, absolutely.
And so you got to Panama, started to grow on you over time. How soon did that idea of, okay, I could start a business here come up? And was that something that had kind of always been in your mind of like, oh, it'd be cool to be an entrepreneur in Latin America?
Not so much Latin America, but always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I always wanted to do my own thing. So I knew I didn't want to follow like a direct path of go to law school, become a lawyer, work for 30 years, retire, or, whichever profession. So after Peace Corps, I had moved back to New York. I was living on my dad's couch in Manhattan, and all my friends were 25, were working in big law firms or for big banks, hating what they did, like basically spending all their money on their rent. And I just didn't, 4 months in New York, it just didn't seem like it was the right place for me. So I took the $1,500 that I had saved from temping, literally stuffing envelopes in an office building, and went back down to Ecuador and Colombia and was traveling with friends there. And after Colombia, the friend who I was with was living in Panama, and he was flying back to Panama from Colombia. And I was like, okay, I've got a couple $100 in my bank account. I don't want to go back to New York. And he's like, come to the San Blas Islands in Panama. I was like, perfect. That sounds like a great idea. So on the plane from Cartagena to Panama, which is an hour flight, I was like, why don't I just start a business in Panama? Everyone I knew who was 25 in Panama was opening a hostel or a bar or doing something cool. And it just seemed like Panama was open for business, especially at the time. 10 years ago, this neighborhood, Casco Viejo, where the school is, there was not much here at the time. So it just seemed like any business you could think of, you could just put here. So
yeah, that's so interesting. And so for us, our first trip to Panama was 2 years ago. So I think Panama City at least is pretty similar now in 2020 as it was 2 years ago. But I'm curious, can you give us a picture of what Panama City was like 10 years ago when you got here?
So this neighborhood especially, there were parts of it where you still couldn't really go at night. So where I lived before was in the border of Casco Viejo and Chorillo. It was like 1 foot in Casco and 1 foot in the ghetto, basically. And at night, I had to walk around the block because they would rob people on the corner at night. So I would go to the one bar in the neighborhood. And because I was too poor to pay the $3 taxi home, I would run around the block to get back home at night. So in terms of safety, for sure, Panama City is incredibly safe, and especially this neighborhood where the school is. But it was surrounded by a neighborhood that wasn't in this neighborhood. If you talk to a Panamanian who's over 50, they'd say, at least 10 years ago, don't go to Casco Viejo. It had a really bad reputation because it hadn't been restored, and so a lot of the buildings were abandoned and squatters had moved in. So it had a reputation with gangs and just as kind of a rough neighborhood. So people would come during the day and then leave. There weren't bars and restaurants. There was like one or two places to go out.
Yeah, and compared to it now, I mean, it's hard to even imagine Casco Viejo like that because it's like, everywhere you look, there's a cool bar, there's a cool restaurant, there's a cool business. There's so much awesome stuff happening in this area of town.
Yeah, I really fell in love with the neighborhood. I wouldn't have started the school anywhere else. It just there's a special energy to it, and it has really a sense of community. So I feel like I know all the neighbors. Even this morning, I was just walking around, dropping off flyers and talking to other business owners, guys who have restaurants and hostels and bars, and just that sense of community where we can, how's your high season? How's your low season? What's up with this? It really feels like home now, especially after all these years.
Yeah, and I know with coming out of college, doing something like joining the Peace Corps, a lot of friends, family are like, that's cool, that's amazing that you're doing something like that. And then for us, so we did, a big trip out at that period, very much people were like, oh, cool, that's great for you. And then when you kind of like keep doing stuff like that, people start to be like, okay, like what's going on? When are you coming back home and following the normal life course? What did kind of friends and family think when you were like, hey, I'm going to open a business in Panama?
I think my parents definitely thought it was a phase. My friends were excited. They'd see pictures. Oh, he's at the beach. He's at an island. He's traveling. But I think they figured at some point, how is he funding this and what is he doing? Especially after the Peace Corps, I went on that huge trip, but I spent all the money I had saved up on the trip. So I wasn't earning any money. And when I got to Panama, I was broke. I was living on a friend's couch and I really needed to start earning money. So I really think everyone thought, okay, at some point he's going to come back and get a job because, what's he going to do in Panama?
Right. Yeah. And I kind of understand it, like, from the perspective of, somebody who makes income in a weird way, I guess. I, understand when people are like, I don't really get what you do. And I think that, especially when you go to another place and you start a business somewhere else, I think that if you've never gone down that route or that road, it can be a very foreign thing for people. Like, people don't think about, like, oh, you can just open a business in Panama. They just think, like, oh, you're just hanging out there.
And it certainly wasn't a straight path either. I mean, the Spanish school is the fourth business I opened. The first three don't exist anymore. So I came and I was like, I'll do an SAT tutoring company because I had a friend in New York who had one and was very successful. And I said, okay, well, I'll just copy what you're doing there and I'll do it here. And I had a name. My last name is Gold. So I was Gold Prep. And I had, business cards and I had the books and I did well on the SATs. This is the college entrance exam to go to school in the US. And I figured there's got to be wealthy Panamanians who want to go to school in the US and I can help them get into college. But to do that, you needed clients and I only had one. So I spent about 6 months trying, hustling, trying to like meet people and network. And I managed to get one student, which wasn't nearly enough to pay rent or, feed myself. So I ended up having to get a job teaching English at another school. And that's where I realized, okay, this is so easy. Why don't I just open an English school? And at that point, everyone wanted to learn English. All the taxi drivers, all the waiters, everyone would come up to me and ask me to teach them English. So I figured, okay, English schools here are very expensive. Why don't I do English for everyone? So everyone's got $5 in their pocket and everyone wants to learn English. So I'll do a school for the masses. Turned out to be a horrible business.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious about that. Can you tell us a bit more about that business and how that went?
Yeah, so basically, it was in New York English because I'm from the New York area and that's where I was living last. But New York English and the tagline was Inglés para la gente, which is English for the people. And in Panama, they often cut the words off. So instead of saying para, they say pa. So it's Inglés para la gente, English for the people. And yeah, basically it was, English for poor people, but it turns out poor people don't have money. So it wasn't really a good business. I mean, you can be McDonald's and sell hamburgers for $1, but you have to sell 1 million hamburgers. Or you can be like every other restaurant and sell hamburgers for $5 or $10, which is, there's a reason that most restaurants don't sell burgers for $1. So I basically realized I was working much more than I would have if I had just gotten a traditional job at a school, and I was making less money because I had overhead. And so it was all this work for less money. I hadn't even calculated basically my real opportunity cost. Like if I had to pay another teacher a normal wage, I would have been losing money.
Right. That makes sense. And then so at what point were you like, oh, English speakers coming to Panama who want to learn Spanish? When did that
I had
happen?
the idea kind of in the back of my mind, but as I mentioned, I had no money really when I came to the English school. I had a friend who had a space in the lobby of his building, and he said, you can use it for free, but when you start making money, you can start paying rent. So I was basically in the lobby of an apartment building, and the only thing I did was pay to put a dividing wall from the stairs, so people walking in and out of their apartments, it'd be a little bit separate, and I put an air conditioner on the wall and a whiteboard. And then I got a folding table and some chairs. So I think it was $1,000 investment in the beginning for the English school, and that made, as I said, really no money. But what did happen is basically I said that what I tell people is the market will tell you what it wants. So the businesses nearby approached me. Basically, the developer who was building a big hotel, the first nice hotel in the area, and he said, "Can you train all my waiters and housekeepers in English?" I said, "Absolutely." He said, "It takes about a year to get from beginner to intermediate." I said, "No. I just need fork, knife, spoon. Would you like another beer? How would you like your steak cooked?" So it was a restaurant English or English for housekeeping or hospitality staff course that was like very specialized, so English for specific purposes, and at the end of the course, they should be able to, basically, deal with a customer in English. But if they had asked about the weather or like how old they are, they would have said, sorry?
It's actually kind of funny. So my parents are coming down in about a month. And so they speak no Spanish, like cerveza, baño, por favor, hola, like gracias. That's all. And that's even, my mom gets a little frazzled with those words. And so we were talking about, how things are here. And I was like, as soon as you arrive, people are going to speak Spanish, but the people at customs know what needs to be said to get you through in English. I was like, do not ask them anything else though. They know how to say like, put your finger here, where are you staying, how many days, but like,
exactly.
Don't
The
ask them any
security
questions.
people at the airport, they know all the words. They're like belt, shoes, watch. They know what to tell you to take off, but
Yeah.
I don't think they can say anything else.
And so the English business started growing and developing. What kind of happened from there?
So basically, the Spanish school was always in the back of my mind since I came to the neighborhood. It was an idea I had after the SAT business failed, basically. But in order to do a school, I needed a location that people would feel comfortable coming to. And the lobby of my friend's building was right where I was living. So it was right on the border. It wasn't a nice part of the old city, and it wasn't going to get any foot traffic. So I didn't think foreigners would go there. So I needed a space, and I needed to be able to at least pay rent or find a space that I could afford. And I needed at least one person that would teach the Spanish. I wasn't going to be the teacher. And that was actually one of the things that was most excited about, was to stop teaching. Because at one point, especially with the English for hotels, I found myself not so much having a business, but having a job. So I was basically trading time for money, and it was 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., me on a motorcycle going around the city, teaching English to hotels and restaurants and businesses all over the city. But it was, I hit a wall, and I said, okay, I'm only going to be able to make as much money as I can trade my time for. And it wasn't the quality of life or the what I was looking for in having a business.
Yeah, and I don't know if you thought about this. Maybe you can tell us or not. But I feel like something I always think about with these types of things is like, I love the life of living abroad and having those adventures. But at some point, it crosses my mind. Like, I have a college education. I could go get a well-paying job at home, and it's like the trade-off does have to be there for me in terms of like, if I go home and get a job that I like enough, and it pays me well, what I'm doing abroad needs to at least like have some sort of benefit above that. Did you have kind of that thought process at all? Like, I'm not making very much money. I'm hustling my ass off. I could just go home, work a little less, make more money.
Yeah, I didn't really think about going back, but I thought about the reason I came. And so like, I wanted a quality of life. I wanted, a business where I didn't have to be there. I found myself that if I, even just to go for a week or two on vacation was a real push, and I had to find another teacher to cover a friend or another person who was teaching English at the time. And so I really just felt tied to the business, and it felt like, a weight. And the whole idea of having a business was to have freedom. So it didn't really mesh the two ideas where, yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
And so what was the next step that allowed you to kind of move into your own space here in Casco and open the Spanish school?
So I got really lucky. Basically, there's a couple big developers in the neighborhood that had bought up a lot of property, and they had these buildings. They had one building in particular that was a community center. And so it was all full of nonprofits and artists, and then there were some architects on the roof. So there was an after-school program for kids and another one that trained women, and they had these spaces, but in order to get into the community center, you had to show that you were a social enterprise or that you were going to give back to the community in a certain way. And so we had applied for a space in the building, and I had a friend who was working with the developer at the time who made an introduction, and he liked the idea and basically sponsored the school by giving us a nonprofit rate for our first space. So we had the 6 months of basically free or almost free rent to give it a go. And then after that, once the business took off and we needed to rent more classroom space, we were paying market rate. But at least at that point, we had a proof of concept, and it wasn't too expensive to start. So I put all the money I had at the time into the business to start it, but it was doable on my own. I didn't have to take on investors, and it was really allowed us to grow organically at the beginning, because really the first couple of years we didn't make any money, and I was still teaching English on the side to fund the business. So we'd have all the money we would take in would cover salaries and rent and electricity and whatnot, and then my English income was the money I was living off at the time.
Okay, awesome. And so now that's kind of, it's been a while that you've been down in here teaching in working, opening businesses in Panama. And I think a lot of people, definitely myself included, think about that idea of like going somewhere new, opening a business. Maybe it's almost like kind of like an American frontier thing, right? Of like, oh, that'd be so cool. I'm going to move out to California and like open a business. But there's a point, right, where that like romantic idea, once you've gone somewhere and been there, it just becomes normal life. What's kind of your relationship been with Panama over the time you've been here in terms of how it feels to be here and kind of integrating with the culture and being part of a new country?
So it definitely comes in waves. I have moments where I'm like, this is the best place ever. And then I have moments where you hit a wall and you said, what am I doing here? Especially trying to get things done sometimes with the government or the electrical company or the phone company, things don't work. And there are definitely challenges unique to Panama and working in this environment. But I personally love it. It's been over 10 years, and now having the business at a place where I have enough full-time employees, have a full-time director and HR, and enough of a infrastructure here that I can be away from the business for weeks at a time and everything goes smoothly, or smoothly enough, that I don't have to come back. So it's allowed me to have the freedom to leave and come back. And I think when you come back, you really appreciate the things that we had, that at least I have here in Panama. The ability to go away, the weather, the ability to travel and to go away on the weekends. I mean, Panama's all coast and islands and mountains and jungle. And
yeah, and just even being in this part of the city, I feel like, so we're doing classes on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons, and we're like over in an apartment in San Francisco, which is a nice area of Panama City, but we're kind of like hunkered down in our apartment the rest of the time, like working. And sometimes you lose focus of like, what are we doing? You forget that it's like negative 60 bazillion in Canada. And then you come over here and it's like sunset and we start walking back towards the city and it's beautiful. It's like, so it's just an amazing picture that you can't paint on a podcast. But I think that kind of reminds us, and I could imagine you as well, just being in this location that's so picturesque and beautiful.
Yeah, when you're in that work mode and I'm just going back and forth and so focused on work, and in my head sometimes you really just have to step back and you hear the birds chirping at sunset. And Casco Viejo is a peninsula, so it's on water on all directions. And where my apartment is actually 2 blocks from here, it opens up onto the water. So I have these 4 French doors that open up onto the water and onto a plaza. And I rarely sit on my balcony, but there's sometimes after work where I just take off my shoes, kick up my feet, and watch the waves come in and people walking around and really just, taking in where I am. Unfortunately, it's not, I wish I was more present always and mindful and, always in the moment. I think I should be doing more yoga. But
I was going to say, I'm a yoga teacher and I'm still practicing that. So I think it's just part of the human condition.
But yeah, there's some times where it just hits you. I'm like, feel so blessed to be, #grateful in Panama, especially now. So I started kite surfing And so every weekend, as soon as I got off work, I'm driving an hour and 20 minutes out of the city to Punta Chalme, which is the kite surf beach. And it's just a beautiful beach. And so I'm watching sunrises, I'm watching sunsets, I'm on the water like hours at a time. And there's a nice group of people, mostly expats and some Panamanians. The guy who runs is British, and people come in. So you just hang out with the same people every weekend, catching up and, having that little sense of community. I think Panama's a country of a couple of million people, and the city is over 1 million, but really feels like a small town, especially the same. So every time I go to the beach or to the mountains or the jungle, I always run into people I know everywhere. So I kind of like that feeling of, knowing everyone.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We ended up, we were looking for an apartment to rent. We rented an apartment, and then a friend from a company that I used to work for connected Amanda to someone she had met because they were doing the same online course here. And then so we went out and got coffee with her, and then she knew the person, our landlord, who we just rented an apartment from. It just seems like so many people are just overlapping.
6 degrees of separation in Panama. It's 2.
Yeah.
I always turn around before I say anything about anyone because I once, my sister was visiting and I was telling a story about someone who lived in the apartment upstairs, and I was pointing and speaking loudly, the typical ugly American, and that guy, and I turn around and his partner, his husband, was right there. And I was like, oh my God, he heard everything I said. I hope it was, complimentary, but.
Yeah, that's where we're we need a new language, because when we go back to Canada, we're at a table and we want to start talking about someone, we start talking in Spanish. Here it's tough because more people speak English, and we're we need to learn Japanese or something so we can communicate about things of other people in our surroundings.
Exactly. Someone was just telling me they have a Polish maid back in Europe, and so the kids speak to each other in Polish, which is their secret language. So only the maid and the kids speak Polish, but the parents don't. So,
oh my gosh, I feel like that's dangerous if you're the parents. You're what are you plotting against me, children? But yeah, that's all really interesting to hear about. And something I'm curious about from kind of the logistical standpoint is we've talked a little bit about starting a business here, but what was kind of the legal side of starting a business here? Because I imagine it was, they say Panama's kind of easy to start a business in, but easy's relative. Anything with governments is
I think
hard.
if you have money, it's very easy. The problem is I didn't have any, so everything was, how can I do this on my own? And I definitely struggled at the beginning with permits and taxes and things like that, because I was kind of, do it and ask for permission instead of ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. So I would just I hung up a sign, and then the city came by and they're like, "Where's your sign tax?" I was like, "What's a sign tax?" And so I would have to deal with those things kind of after the fact. So people, a lot of people come in, fumigation. Where's your fumigation, thing from the city? I need to fumigate. I'm so sorry, officer. And luckily I had friends who had businesses who gave me some great advice in terms of dealing with authorities. They always, just offer them coffee, be super nice, kill them with kindness, and just apologize. I had no idea, officer. I didn't know you were, you had to fumigate or whatever it is. And then definitely don't pay a bribe, because they'll see you as, every Mother's Day, every Christmas, every whatever, you could pay them probably $20 and get out of $100 fine, but then they're going to be coming back and it'll be something else every time. So a lot of the times it was just, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I would love to be totally legal. How do I do this? Please show me. And I think if you go with that attitude, they'll be most of the time realize, okay, this guy's just trying to do the right thing, and they'd help you out. And so a lot of the times I wouldn't even get the fine, I would get help. But Panama has something called Panama Emprende, which is Panama Startup, basically. If you Google Panama Emprende, it comes up, and there's actually the site's in English. And you could get at the time a business permit for $15. Oh, wow. So as a natural person, as a regular person, so the business would be in my name, which I'm sure a lawyer would tell you, don't do that because then you're personally liable, but liable for, I have nothing. So it was only up from there. So I figured that $15 permit, I could print it out online, pay with a Visa, and just put it on the wall. And all of a sudden I had a business license. And then I figured I need to register with the city. So I did that. And then, little by little, fumigating. I kind of figured it out as I went and made a bunch of mistakes along the way. Until finally, a couple of years into it, I had enough money to start a corporation. And that's what lawyers would say, you shouldn't have employees working for you as a person, because then you're personally liable. So I formed a corporation and then got a new business license. Instead of $15, I think it was $50. I could also do online myself. and registered the business through the city as a corporation, and then took on employees and more formalized it. At that point, I started paying people Social Security, healthcare, 30 days paid vacation, all the legal requirements for having employees in Panama.
Okay, and all that stuff is similar to the U.S. then?
Yeah, I think so. I've never owned a business in the U.S. I think in Panama, actually, it's a lot better to be an employee in Panama than in the U.S. Maybe not salary-wise, but in terms of benefits. So the law definitely favors the employees here. So a lot of people don't have full-time employees because if you do, you have to pay them, I think, over 30% on top of their salary in terms of benefits. So they work 11 months, they get 30 days off, and then they get a 13th month salary in addition. Plus they get Social Security, which is partially paid by them and mostly paid by the employer. So there's a lot of requirements for having real employees. The thing is, a lot of people will just do professional services, so they'd pay hourly employees, but which is what I did at the beginning because it was all I could afford. But it came back to bite me in the ass because my first director, who's my first employee, she was professional services for the first year and a half, and I had paid her to create the material, the books we had and everything. But I made the mistake of letting her register those books in both of our names because she really wanted to be a published author. And then the problem is when I had to let her go, she sued me over the books and past use. And she wanted, $10,000 for the books that she owned that I was using without paying her the rights to, this whole legal case, which would have cost me more to fight. So I think at the end I had to pay her $7,000 to go away, which was past Social Security, past vacation, all these extra payments for firing plus the use of the book. So I had to pay a lawyer and then settle because he told me, he's like, you're going to lose because the law is always in favor of the employee. And yeah, you didn't pay vacation, Social Security, whatever the legal things you were supposed to. So it was a very expensive mistake. And in that 6-month period, I think I lost her. And then trying to make up for it, I paid another employee more than I had my current staff because she had a master's degree and she was from Spain. And I thought this person's going to come and be the new director. And because I had brought in some from outside and paid them more, the current employees were offended and quit. And so within 6 months, no one who had worked at the school knew anything. They were all brand new. And I was like, well, maybe I just close at this point. I had made a bunch of money and then lost a bunch of money. I was starting from scratch a couple of years into it. And it was almost like maybe this is it. Maybe I should just, call it a day.
Yeah. And how do you kind of get your motivation back and keep going when that happens?
I mean, the phone keeps ringing. People would come back in, another email for another student, and you would just, hire another teacher and keep going. It's definitely, I think with anything, you have days where you feel like you're going to conquer the world and days where you feel like, everything is too much. There's a saying in Spanish, like la gota que derramó el vaso, like the drop that made the water spill out of the cup, the straw that broke the camel's back. And, there are definitely days where the smallest thing, this isn't worth it. But for me, I think it was, just the lifestyle I was hoping to have in Panama. Having to pay rent and having to keep going and the momentum. At this point, I had publicly committed to having a business. And I think when it was, had a website and a Facebook page and people knew I had opened a school. And so I really, at this point, this being the fourth thing, I didn't want to close it again and start. I was like, I could see that it could work, but it wasn't easy, especially at the beginning.
Yeah. And something that actually makes me think of is like, is it challenging to find good employees, especially like as an international person? Like, I feel like it's always challenging to find good people, but then it's like, when there's a little bit of a language barrier, there's a culture difference. Does that make it even more challenging?
Yes, absolutely. And that's especially with a business like ours, because all we're selling is people. I mean, like we built a beautiful school and we have air conditioning and, I think it's a great spot to do it. But really what you're paying for is the teacher and the quality of the teacher. So if we don't have great teachers, then we don't have anything. So for me, finding the employees was the hardest part. And for the last 6 years, we've had a full-time academic director who's now the general director of the school. And she has 3 master's degrees, one in HR, one in psychology, and one in education. So she's basically running the school on like an operational basis, and she does all the hiring and firing and training. And, when we interview staff, we start with about 100 people who apply for a job, of which probably 30 are actually qualified, have degrees in education or Spanish, and we'll call them in for interviews. Panama, especially at the beginning, the economy was booming. It was about 10% growth a year. So everyone was moving from, the minimum wage doubled while I've been here, which is a huge jump. So it was really hard to find people because people were jumping ship constantly to make a couple bucks more somewhere else. So we really had to find those people who were passionate about teaching and just filter and filter and filter. So the way that, as I mentioned, the labor laws, once you have someone on for 3 months, they're a permanent employee basically. And so they're kind of locked into that contract. So if you have them for a year and at 3 months and 1 day, they do something and you want to fire them, you pay them out the rest of the year. So it was very, basically old adage, you hire slowly and fire quickly. You basically have those 3 months training period to get as much feedback. You throw them in front of as many students. And we have a lot of forms. We give students a first day feedback form. And then every time you change teacher, you get like an end of a course or a weekly form. We're constantly trying to get feedback from the students to make sure that everything's going well, because the last thing we want is to have a permanent employee who's not amazing.
Yeah, wow. I didn't know about that labor law. That's challenging for sure.
Yeah, and expensive.
And so you talked a bit earlier about just reminding yourself that you love Panama. There's so many good things about it. What are the things that you kind of love most that stand out to you when you think about why life is great here?
So I touched on it a little bit, but the neighborhood I live in, the neighborhood the school is, Casco Antiguo, is really a special place. You can walk out and there's everything here. It's kind of this little bubble, which is good and bad, but because I live and work here, I rarely leave the area. So for me, this neighborhood specifically, it's also the second most visited place in Panama after the canal. But for me, it's the kind of the mix, because I'm a very social person and I like big cities. So like I went to school in Montreal and I was living in New York, and I've always been drawn to cities. And so Panama has that kind of mix of Bolivia, a little bit of third world. You don't have to go very far to get a little taste of the third world, and a little, adventure, even like, going grocery shopping. If you want to go get something fixed or go to the market or do something, can be like a little mini adventure. I like that, but also that you have these like first world amenities of, you can go to the movie theater with like a lazy boy recliner, leather chair, push a button, order sushi in the movie. Those kind of, mix of first and third world. And for me, travel, I've been traveling since I was 15 on my own, and I love exploring. And so being in Central America, being able to go to Colombia, go to South America, go back to the US, Europe, I spend about 3 months a year traveling. And so just in the last couple of years, where I could finally step away from the business a bit and have it running on its own, or be able to, do email and phone calls for an hour or two a day, and, phone it in from abroad, knowing that I have someone here managing the staff. And if there's an emergency or something happens, that they can deal with it on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. And so if somebody was interested in, I guess, taking a trip to Panama City, what would be, or Panama in general, what are some of your favorite things about the country as a whole? Like, what are some of your favorite places you've been to?
My two favorite places close to the city, and that are like the two weekend destinations I always recommend, are the San Blas Islands, which are spectacular. It's like the Windows 95 screensaver. It's like a little piece of sand and a palm tree. The biggest island is like, maybe a 10-minute walk around.
Wow.
And it's an indigenous province. They call them comarcas. So it's the San Blas is the Spanish name. So it's Cunayala, or Gunayala, it's spelled with a K, but pronounced with a G. So it's an indigenous province, and they have their own laws. It's actually a matriarchy.
That's interesting.
The land, the name, everything passes on through. You see how the women are dressed in these elaborate dress, and then the men kind of wear kind of normal clothes. Kind of alludes to it. So San Blas for me is a really special place. My first neighbor where I used to live was Cuna. And so when I go to basically like a family's island. So I've spent Christmas with them. We've gotten pooled money together with friends and gotten like 100 presents, and all the kids from the neighboring islands come and we hand out gifts to the kids. And so it's almost like visiting, for me, like friends when you go. But it's like, crystal clear water and snorkeling, and just like a really special place. When I go there, disconnecting, you feel like you're in a whole nother world. And it's a 2-hour drive and a 30-minute boat ride. So to come back, for me, it's just coming back the drive into the city when you see the skyline of Panama City, which almost looks like, I don't know, Tokyo or Hong Kong or something. Panama has more skyscrapers, I think, of the 20 tallest buildings in Latin America, Panama has 15 of them. And that's including, Mexico City and Sao Paulo, cities that are, 10 times the size of Panama, if not more. So that culture shock. And then the other place is El Valle, the El Valle de Anton, which is the largest inhabited volcanic crater in the world. So it's a town inside a volcanic crater, which you don't realize right away when you go there until you look up and you see that the mountains are 360 degrees, like around you, there are mountains, and you're actually inside the crater. So that has cooler weather, so it's a little bit higher in elevation, and it's just full of waterfalls and hiking and just a great place to relax on the weekend.
Yeah, I remember watching a video that someone had, and they had like drone footage of Valle de Anton, and being like, "Oh, we need to go there." We still haven't yet. We're going in March, but yeah, it looks amazing. And something that's interesting about Panama is that it's kind of like it's a popular tourist country, but like also not a popular tourist country because it's like the canal is really popular. People kind of know about Panama City, but outside of Panama City and maybe Bocas del Toro, people don't really like know about Panama, and people don't travel it the same way that they do Costa Rica or Colombia.
Yeah, which is part of the appeal, I think. I mean, it really is off the beaten track. I mean, if people come to Panama, they go to those 2 or 3 spots, but there are so many small towns and beaches and islands. I think Panama has 1,600 islands. So, I mean, it's all coast. So, I mean, I have friends now that live, people I met in the city 10 years ago, 8 years ago, that have since married, had kids, and moved out to these little towns at the beach. So, for me, long weekends to be able to get out and, visit friends and, so beach, mountain, islands, jungle, kind of has everything. And because it's a small country, it's pretty accessible. The roads are good. It's safe. It's on the US dollar.
Yeah, we so before we came to Panama, we spent about a month in Costa Rica, and then just this 2 weekends ago, we went to Boquete, rented a car. And so we were still experiencing some like Costa Rica driving PTSD of like, oh God, we're getting in a car. What's going to happen? But yeah, the roads, just amazing relative to like Central America.
Yeah, I always just tell people to put Waze on their phone, which is like the navigation app similar to Google Maps, but Waze, people can mark the police because there's one road in Panama, the Interamericana, which is the road that goes from Alaska to Argentina. And so it's that road that's obviously the one highway through Panama, but it's constantly going from 100 kilometers an hour to 60 to 100 to 60. And if you're not paying close attention, right where it turns to 60, there's always a cop being like, pull over, and usually $20 will get you out of it, but it's way better not to even be in that situation, especially if you don't speak the language. I mean, I always speak in English. I could have a shirt that says Casco Antiguo Spanish School. Just say, "Good morning, officer. How you doing today?" It's like...
like, I'm beginner level Spanish.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I actually noticed that I was driving when we had our rental car in Boquete, and even they have, a 2-lane highway going both directions. And for a good chunk of it, it was 60 kilometers an hour. And for a good chunk, it was 80 kilometers an hour. And I was like, man, I could be cruising at like 110 here. Like,
oh, easily.
So
and
you're
supposedly like in a town, but there maybe is one house that you don't see in the distance. So it's not intuitive where you should be going slow and where you should be going fast. So
yeah, absolutely. And so if anyone's listening and they're kind of, I guess, like excited about the idea of maybe coming to Panama, getting their permanent residency, opening a business, do you have any top tips based on what you learned over the last 10 years?
Well, of course, my first tip is to learn the language, because otherwise you're kind of in a bubble. There are people in Panama who speak English, and you could live in a fancy tower, like I think the Trump Tower, a nice area, or Casco Viejo, and not, but you're really limiting yourself. But I think Panama has something called the Friendly Nations visa. It was really easy to immigrate to Panama. I think for about $2,000 or $3,000, you can get permanent residency and a work permit, and you'll be here. Especially there's huge tax advantages for people who don't have to pay international tax. So if you're American, unfortunately, it doesn't apply. I have to, as an American, file U.S. taxes, but I'm still have a foreign earned exemption. So I think it's $100,000 a year that I could declare and not pay U.S. tax on. I still have to pay Social Security and other things, but that first $100,000 is a huge benefit from living abroad. So other tips for being in Panama. I'd say move slow. So a lot of people come in gung ho and do spend a lot of money on all that paperwork and legal stuff and buying apartments and properties and get really excited, but it might not be for them. So I'd say give yourself at least 6 months to a year where you're renting and trying different places. Panama's really lenient. For most countries, you have 180 days you can stay in the country. So either 3 months or 6 months you can stay without having to leave. And even if you do need to make a border run and go up to Costa Rica or fly back to the States or Colombia, it's cheap and easy. And then you can come back and stay for another 6 months. So I myself waited several years to get my residency because especially starting a business, I was putting everything back into the business, and I wasn't working like officially as an employee. I wasn't on payroll, and I wasn't at the front desk, doing all the work. So I could just say, hey, I own this business, and I'm not working here. I'm just checking in on my investment. Until I finally was like, okay, went through the paperwork. But like anything, I think it's easier to test the market and see if it's for you before you just go in like all in, because people are stuck buying apartments and houses and things, and it's not a liquid asset.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a good piece of advice for sure. And then if somebody is going to do that, maybe they don't speak fluent Spanish, do you just recommend like maybe hire somebody? Well, of course, studying Spanish.
What do you mean, to help you with the process?
Yeah.
Of adjusting? Yeah, so there's a lot of relocation services, and like lawyers themselves here are often like businessmen. They do everything, which is good and bad. But yeah, no, I think most of the lawyers you hire will help you refer to people who can help, get you set up, real estate agents and people who are like, I don't know, almost like fixers who can help you, get everything set up initially. But yeah, I mean, I always tell people at the beginning to like kind of throw yourself to make Spanish a priority. Because it's easy to get stuck in that relying on someone with that crutch. Because once you have, whatever, it could be an English speaking maid or something like that, then if you don't need it, then you might not, push yourself to learn it. So we have a 20-hour a week, 4-hour day immersion, like a small group intensive, it's called. It's a really small group, usually 2 or 3 people and a teacher, and it's 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And so with that, usually 2 or 3 weeks, you jump a level every 3 weeks. So you can get a really strong base in the language and enough to get by and do what you need to really just after a few weeks. So,
yeah, and I think it just adds so much to your experience. I know when we went backpacking in South America in 2014 and came in with basically no Spanish skills, and doing those Spanish lessons as we went was always really fulfilling and enjoyable, and just adds so much to your experience where you're not like walking around almost like afraid of someone engaging with you. You get to feel more confident day by day.
Yeah, and I felt like the world doubled in size once I could actually have real conversations with the taxi driver or whatever. I could learn so much. I'm just looking out and through my own filter, my own like lens of what's going on outside, and being like, had my own prejudices, ideas of what I was seeing. And then he'd tell me something. Oh, okay, is this a protest? Or is this a parade? Is this like, what's the holiday? What are they celebrating? Why? I had Spanish in school. I mean, you guys are in Canada. You have French usually?
So you have to do French through elementary school, but then you can typically choose in high school. So we actually both did Spanish in high school, but I like to just, whenever someone asks how long we've been studying Spanish for, completely eliminate that because I learned absolutely nothing.
Oh, so I had 7 years of Spanish. So from middle school all the way through grade 11, I had Spanish in school. And I got to Bolivia for the Peace Corps, and they do a language test at the beginning. They do a 3-month training, and they tested me in as a beginner too. After 7 years, I was like, this is crazy. I even took a course at McGill at the end to try to like brush up on like continuing ed. So I should have been way better. And then after 3 months of the intensive training in the Peace Corps, it's the same exact method, 4 hours a day in a really small group. I tested out at a high intermediate, which is like everything I needed to say and do, I could in Spanish, I was like, this is how you need to learn the language. So when I came to start the school, our first director and the current director, Adalia, who's the director now, both were Peace Corps language instructors for years before. So they knew the method and they knew the way that I had learned. And so I was like, okay, this is the way. If I'm going to have a school, it has to be the same method.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Like we've definitely seen the most progress from like actually integrating and using our Spanish. I think it's when, it's tough if you're in school in the US, especially like the Northeast, and for us in Canada, there's virtually no native Spanish speakers. And if they are, like they speak English because they have to. And so it's like when you need to ask something, like I need to go to the bathroom and I need to ask somebody where it is, or I need to ask somebody what's on this menu because I need to eat, then you're like, okay, I need to learn these words to communicate with people.
Absolutely. And if you're in an environment where you're speaking Spanish 4 hours a day in the classroom, when you leave the classroom, you feel like you can speak Spanish because you've been doing it. If you're filling in bubbles in the book, then you're preparing yourself to fill in bubbles in a book, which is not what you're going to be doing outside. You're going to have, so even that first day when it's like introducing yourself, saying where you're from, whatever the first class is, we push you out of the classroom and say, go talk to the guy selling Panama hats across the street, ask him where he's from and ask him how old he is and ask him where he lives. And, most of the students are, they're a little nervous, of course, at first, but, this guy's probably talked to thousands of students at this point. So he sees it coming. And they're super patient, and they, people really appreciate, especially waiters and local people, taxi drivers, that you're making the effort. And so I think you find that people are really helpful. Oh,
I guess kind of one question out of curiosity. So after having this experience of like going through and learning a language on your own and having being able to contrast it kind of a more academic school style to like going out, learning it from immersion, starting and kind of learning as you're building the school. What have you kind of learned about learning a language from that experience?
Everyone does it differently. Everyone learns at their own speed. So we have people who come in all the time and say, how long will it take me to learn Spanish? And I say anyone who tells you a certain amount of time is lying. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule. We have an idea about how many weeks it takes to do a level. And some people, we've had like a Swiss girl who already speaks, she's 18 years old and already speaks 4 languages. This is her 5th. In a month, she's basically, advanced, which is incredible. And there's, older retired couples, who will take them longer. But we've also have a guy who's in his 70s who's almost fluent now. And, and so it really, there's such a difference in how people learn and the speed at which they do. So one of the strengths, I think, of the school is that we don't say this course starts here and in 5 weeks it ends here and you'll have to finish that amount of material. We redo the groups every week based on how people are learning, because it's not, it's not real that you'll actually progress at the same speed. So, a couple might start together in an intensive program and after 2 or 3 weeks end up in different groups because they learn at different speeds. And then also the way people learn. So some people need to see it written. Some people need to, go out and, it's kinesthetic, actually be moving and use it. And other people just, really want to look at it and understand the rules before they do anything. So, the teachers really have to balance the different needs in the classroom so that you're touching on all the different ways people learn. So it's like songs and getting out and practicing, different games and activities. The idea really is to get from the teaching part to the doing part as quickly as possible, so that you're speaking a lot more than the teacher. It's not a lecture style. You should be speaking and doing as much as possible so that when you leave, you're prepared, to do it.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like going through the journey of learning Spanish has been like, such a roller coaster ride for us, or at least for me. I guess I should just speak.
You guys spent time in Mexico, right?
Yeah. So our Spanish journey was like, obviously we learned it in school, basically had no Spanish. We went to Spain shortly, I guess 4 years after university. So hadn't used any Spanish, but we're like, oh, we learned a little bit in school. We'll be good to get by. And it was so bad. Honestly, David, it was like we had to ask for a train to get back from Pamplona to Barcelona after running the Bulls. And I went up and I was like, ¿hablas inglés? And he was like, no, like this old frumpy Spanish dude. And then I was like, train a Barcelona a Domingo. And he was like, no. And I was like, no, what? Like, I don't have any more words to say. Like, I would look at menus because I'm kind of picky about what meats I eat. And I would see something with pollo and I would just order that because I knew if it comes out as chicken, I'm good. Like, I like chicken. It was so embarrassing and so challenging. And for us, that was like, okay, if we go to a Spanish speaking country again, we have to learn. And so then we studied a little bit more while we were in South America, took Spanish lessons. And then when we moved to Mexico, it was like, okay, game on. We like really need to learn this because we have to do all these things like sign a lease and find a co-working space and order food every single day. And if we don't speak Spanish, like we're kind of screwed.
So in Mexico, you guys got by. I mean, you reached a point where you could do what you needed to in Spanish?
Yeah, I'd say that was kind of the transition, was that point. We spent, almost a year in Mexico City. And it was kind of tricky because I think we learned what we needed to get by. But again, we were working at a co-working space, doing all our work in English. And most people there spoke English. And you'd be in that situation of like walking around the co-working space. Someone asks you like, a question and you don't really hear what they say, and then boom, they switch to English. So we learned kind of how to get by during that time in Mexico.
Yeah, I would say we were like an intermediate conversational, very fluent in menus.
Do you find yourself here in Panama now with more chances to practice? Like we see you guys a couple of days a week in, before and after class, and I assume you're speaking Spanish in those couple hours while you're at the school, but when you leave, do you have opportunities to practice?
Yeah. So, I mean, all of our kind of like interactions, we kind of, annoy our security guards at the building with like every small issue and talk to them, and then try to get Uber drivers in conversation. And just, I find as you kind of walk around and do stuff, there's lots of good opportunities. And then what we've tried to do, I think both of us really just connected with Latin culture. When we traveled here, it just kind of stood out, like the music and going to concerts. So we both love listening to all types of Spanish music and do that and watch shows as much as we can, and are both currently attempting to read our way through some Spanish books as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, for me, especially in Bolivia, what I found was really important was the practice, is that once you leave class, or to get out and to actually use it. So one of the things we do at the school is free social activities. So every day, today, for example, is Tuesday, we're going to have a happy hour. Tomorrow we have salsa lessons. Thursday we have a sunset bike tour, and Friday we have beach volleyball. And so there's someone from the school, and you get to meet the other students who aren't in class with you, who are a different schedule, and you get to practice Spanish outside of class. So you're biking at sunset and you're practicing Spanish, and you get to really get that extra practice. Another thing we also do is volunteering. So we still have close relationships with those nonprofits that we used to be in the same building with. We've since moved out of the community center, now in a freestanding building, but we still organize volunteering free of charge for students at the school. So people will help teach English or tutor kids, play games. So people usually bring certain skills to the table. I'm an art teacher or yoga or this, and I want to do a workshop with the kids. And so they'll meet the director, and then they'll plan a workshop, ideally in Spanish, with the kids, which is a great way to practice, because kids don't really judge you, and they're not going to correct you, and it's really easy to talk to them usually.
Yeah, it's funny. We just like going around shopping and stuff. Often you'll like see, kids talking to their parents in Spanish, and we're both like, I wish like we could just like chat with kids all day, because they speak such clear, slow Spanish. We're like, we can hear everything they're saying.
The parents would probably just take them. They're fine.
Yeah, it's true. We should actually just be like, hey, we just live down the street. Can we get your kid for
yeah.
You'd be surprised. I mean, when I had the motorcycle, there was one of the neighbors here. It was actually the aunt who's watching the kids, and she would be out in the street under a street lamp, like helping the kids with their homework. And I would drive by on the motorcycle, and the kid would be like, give me a ride. And like the last thing I'm gonna do is put this kid. I know who he is, but I'm not gonna give him a ride on the motorcycle, like the liability and this and whatever. And the aunt's like, yeah, take him on the motorcycle. And I was like, okay. And so I made this giving this little kid, I mean, probably 7 or 8 years old, a ride on the motorcycle up to Ancon Hill at the time. This beautiful mountain covered in jungle in the middle of the city. And it's probably like an hour to walk it, but only a 10-minute drive. And I drove him up the mountain. At the time, you could drive cars or bikes up to the top of the mountain. And he had never been, he was like right next to where we lived, and he'd never been into this part of the jungle, into this view of the city. And, yeah, no, so I would just go up to the random kids, don't offer them candy and say, come into my van, but yeah, you can,
care of your kid for
those little interactions if you're waiting in line at the supermarket and say, hey, how old are you? Or, I don't know. See how it goes.
Yeah, but those activities, I think we've tried to go to happy hour, actually like strategically scheduled ourselves so we could transition right into happy hour after our Tuesday classes. But I think too, as more and more people do, like stuff like being digital nomads. I know for us, when we go somewhere, we're always trying to find a way to kind of have some type of like community building. And in the past for us, that's been a co-working space where you can kind of build community. And definitely here as well, that's something that stood out to us when we were looking, was like, this would be a good way, because we decided not to have a co-working space here, of like, this is a way for us to continue meeting people and have a connection to a community, because there's events that you can do.
Awesome. Yeah, about half of our students are people who relocate to Panama. So we have a lot of students who meet their friends basically through the school. Either they've been in the class with them, or they met them at a happy hour, and they're newly arrived. And often in Panama, there's a lot of people who come from like multinational corporations, like big companies, Nestle or Dell, or they'll have their headquarters here, or things like the United Nations or the World Bank or Red Cross. And often the spouse is working full time, and either the husband or wife isn't. And so they're just they're learning Spanish and they're hanging out and they've got all the time in the world to play tennis or go on adventures. So we often find like the husbands are free and the wives are working, or vice versa. The husbands are working and the wives are free. And so, people will make lasting friendships. I've had, countless students say that like all of their friends in Panama, they met somehow through the school, which is a great feeling, just, creating that sense of community and an environment where people can come and meet and hang out. And, we have students who come back and visit years later. They're fluent in Spanish and they have no need to come, and they just join in activities or have coffee and meet with their teachers and just, visit, which is a great feeling that they have that kind of sense of belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And so if people are coming to Panama City, obviously they should come study Spanish here.
Absolutely. That's it.
Where can they go to find more information, David?
So the school is called Casco Antiguo Spanish School, and the website is cascospanish.com, CASCO Spanish.com. And we're also on Instagram and Facebook, Casco Spanish.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. This has been awesome to learn more about your story and to just talk more about learning languages in general.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you guys.
Thanks, David. To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at World Wanderers 1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.